Hey, just checking. Looks like the audio's on. Great. Well, first of all, I'd like to say a particular thank you to Viplav. First time I met Viplav was actually online in CCK08. He was very active throughout the course and consistently, I guess, exemplified what I look for nowadays, at least in terms of online participation, which was he was active creating artifacts, he was interacting with others, he was giving his unique spin of how he understood the course content, and I think in the process helped to create that ripple effect of learning where people who had an interaction with Viplab, it's kind of you have a different way of thinking, you see the course in different ways. And I'll talk about this a little more later on, but there's a sense in which all of us in this room have what could be defined as micro-expertise, which means that individually we have competence in a particular area, we're well informed. The challenge is in integrating and connecting that in a meaningful way so that other people can benefit from that. And as a group, we are basically more intelligent than we are individually. And so it's a real pleasure here to be able to connect with Viplav in person, obviously have the opportunity to be involved in this event. This conference is about disruption, and I'm going to be critical of the term right off the start. So there's a variety of ways that we can think about change, and there's different theorists who've put forward a view of what is change and what does it mean to have change happening within society, but specifically the education sector. So there's 5 views in particular. Creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter, you're likely familiar with his work, but basically he says the way new things come is by old things being destroyed. And there's 2 of these theorists that I'm most aligned with, and one of those is creative destruction. Paradigm shifts, I think we've all heard of this term. It's become a bit of a buzzword and it's no longer accurate the way Kuhn intended it. A paradigm shift happens once every 100 years or once every 75 years. The way we hear paradigm shifts discussed, they happen 3 times before breakfast. But that's not true. So really it's this dramatic alteration. The long cycle of adoption, this is where Paul David looks at where new technologies take 40 to 50 years to make a systemic impact. When technologies are first brought on, what happens is they do the work of the old, and then after a period of 40 years, you start to see change in society. Disruptive innovation, when we talk disruption, for some reason, it's one of those terms that automatically gets acquainted or linked to Christensen. And the final one is the techno-socio-economic innovation, which again is the second one I'm most aligned with, which states that new technologies, new economic and social pressures alter the structure of existing institutions. But these are sort of the different ways that people have looked at when they talk about change. I think what's unique today is that these ways of looking at change are coming at us from all sectors. So if we're talking creative destruction, well, you know, Apple's probably one of the biggest vendors in that space, but Netflix and Google certainly follow. If you're looking at paradigm shifts, if you will, social media, semantic data, those are other fields that represent a different way of interacting with information. The long cycle of adoption, you know, in education, technology is evident, but it hasn't been transformative by and large. There's a few instances, but not on a large scale. The techno-socioeconomic, I mean, there's a huge raft that we can tie this into, everything related to periodic technology bursts or bubble implosions. But broadly, we're talking long-term cycles, and long-term cycles indicate a or the flow of capital that's moving from west to east and moving from north to south. And then, of course, the broader knowledge economy that we've heard about for probably 30 plus years, it's actually becoming instantiated in the long-term employment trends. Now, what's disruptive? And I emphasize disruptive, which I'll dig into a little bit more later. Disruptive is not as significant a change as I would like to see. So a lot of the changes that we're seeing are more of a transformative nature around the educational sector. And there's a variety of things. We heard about this. I was fortunate to attend a session yesterday that gave us, as potential contributors to your conference, an overview of what's happening in the Indian education sector. So I found it to be an absolute pleasure and a highlight of the opportunity to learn from others and what's happening. But a variety of these things, you know, the for-profit divide, the growth of technology, economy, a lot of folks harping on quality, right? You know, there's something, it's always funny, something as social and soft and malleable as education inevitably gets targeted with quality metrics, which are really about hardening and reducing that process. Equity and access is quite significant. You know, giving the example of Ramesh that was just presented is a brilliant illustration. And I think it reflects what we're seeing in terms of change pressures for education, where the intent isn't to train one type of student the way we've seen them in the past. It's to train the entire breadth of student from abject poverty down to what might be more of a traditional middle-class student model. And then, of course, the internationalization model, globalization of education. These are all some of the change pressures that are putting a fair bit of emphasis on rethinking what education is. Now, these occur, I guess, in two really broad societal transitions. One is a shift to networks, which Viplav already touched on. We're learning to think and function in networks. I would argue we've actually always have. We've always been part of social networks and structures. But what's unique today is that the networks that we're confronted with, we experience them daily, we experience them everywhere. You pick up a mobile device, you're part of a network. You email a colleague from a different part of the world for research results, you're involved in a network. So networks and knowledge networks are very much a prominent aspect of society today. The second element, which we're not quite as far along as networks, because we live in networks experientially, right? You log on to Twitter, you go onto Facebook, you experience networks, and you start to think in a network structure. But the second one is this notion of a shift to complexity theory, which is where we recognize that when you do things in an education system, it doesn't happen in isolation. So if you decide I'm going to charge more tuition, or you decide I'm going to move what used to be publicly funded education to privately, the student tuition model, these are things that don't just happen like you now took a new hard drive out of your computer and you popped another hard drive in. They change things. There's ripple effects. So a model I've used in the past, it's simplified, but a complicated system is one where every piece has a place, right? So if you take your car apart and you put it back together, if you have extra wheels lying around, you've probably done something wrong because everything has a place. But a complex system is more like the weather, if you will. And what it means, it's a system of individual agents interacting in ways that can't necessarily be anticipated, and the whole system is awash in feedback, which means the agents in the system and the system itself change due to the feedback that's generated by either the system or the agents. So these are the two broad transitions educationally. And with that as a backdrop, I want to sort of launch in just a brief discussion on why I think disruption is too simplistic a term for what we're facing educationally. So I don't like disruption because, well, not surprisingly, it's not disruptive enough. There's something about disruption that really suggests these are forces that unlock gains economically, and this is Christensen's definition, but economically and in terms of social welfare. So really there's potential there, and what disruption really does is it tweaks it, it changes it, and it unlocks it to a certain degree. And so you end up then with systems like Udacity and Khan Academy and Coursera. And what these models do is they disrupt the delivery of education, but they really don't transform it because the model itself is prefaced on instruction. It's prefaced on, I'll tell you what you need to know. We'll structure the content in a certain way. So it's a very simplistic, complicated model of learning, not a complex model of learning. And that's where I think the disruption takes the existing mindset and, if anything, ingrains it even further in long-term instructional systems. So if you look at Udacity, the model is very similar to what you'd see in a classroom. You enroll, you have your course content, it's staged. Most of the time is spent people talking at you, and a little bit of time is spent with you trying to do some work or some of the activities that are involved. So my thinking is much more along the lines of transformative. I don't want something that tweaks the education system and instantiates the current instructor-type model into a digital form. I want something that really questions all of those things, questions whether it's the content or the teaching or the system that we need to change. I mean, in education, we've spent centuries. If there's a new area of knowledge development, we design a new master's program or a new doctoral program. But we don't redesign the system. So I'm trying to move away from thinking about pedagogy or thinking about content to thinking about system and systemic change and redesign. Now, I just want to step back and emphasize that a good portion of the discussion around disruption has an American higher education context. And that's not surprising. I mean, they're very prominent. They're the wealthiest nation in the world. A lot of the technologies we use on a daily basis originate there. So I don't mean this as a negative sense, but when we talk education reform, most of the ideas we're appropriating actually come from a model that isn't relevant in most parts of the world. Most systems, and I'm assuming a good portion of those of you who graduated and got your master's or advanced degrees, didn't leave with $250,000 worth of debt when you were done. You probably had debt, but probably wasn't on that scale. So I just want to emphasize the tuition model of the US system is not one that's prominent around the world. UK is trying very hard to get there, but they're not quite there yet. So when we talk then disruption and transformation, I think we want to look specifically at content, teaching, evaluation assessment, research, but more critically the university model as a whole. So these are some of the spaces where we want to talk or think about disruptive approaches. And the US global model of either tuition or otherwise is one that isn't the norm in this space. So if we talk a little bit about the uncertainty that sits in this area, because there's a very mixed set of messages coming around in terms of the educational transformation globally. On the one hand, there's a lot of attention being paid to the whole system sucks. Everything has to change. The model needs to be redone. But then there's other realities that kind of call that into question a little bit. So I'm going to explain a little bit how these two systems are structured. So on the one hand, we have a very traditional view where you have folks, and this is from a Citibank funded report, but they're emphasizing, you know what, the next 40 years are going to be nothing short of transformational, and it's going to be on par with what you saw during the 18th century, where you started to see the development of the industrial age. So we're not talking something that is a continuation of what's there, but we're talking an entirely new system and way of thinking about economics, education, and the structure of society. So then you have folks, and Drucker's prediction is now, he's about halfway through his cycle of in 30 years, we're going to see these big university campuses being relics, they won't survive. So this is sort of a classic Drucker kind of a claim on what we're going to see happen educationally. Then you have other folks like Bill coming along, Bill Gross, and he says, again, a lot of these come from a market or economist perspective, and emphasize that these four-year degrees, they're not going to be around long term. This is not a model that's going to help a lot of people. We need to change that system. Or we have the Thiel Foundation, and they decided, we're going to take 20 people under the age of 20, we're going to give them $100,000 each, they drop out of school and they actually do something rather than sit in a school sector and learn things that may or may not be relevant. We have others, even traditional publications, such as the Chronicle, which is a fairly conservative publication in the education space, and they're even throwing out this notion of, maybe education isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And it's funny, isn't it? The only people who talk about education isn't all that it's cracked up to be is people who are in very educated countries, right? Everywhere else in the world, people are trying to ramp up education, but it's the same thing, right? If you have the luxury of having been well educated, you kind of dismiss it. But the argument here is it's not an economic solution to everything that ails the world. And from the view of The Economist and the articles that they've been posting around education, they're similarly saying that higher education in particular is an enormous bubble. It's bigger than the property bubble, and we have more in the US context, more student loan debt than credit card debt as a country. So you have some interesting concerns that you face with this as a backdrop. And so The Economist and others ask, are we at the point where this is a bubble and it will implode and it'll cause huge dramatic change in the education sector as a whole? So that's a bit of a backdrop on what people as you can tell, it's a confused space. So the conversation ranges from economic to the social impact to the structural impact of society, and there's not really a clear sense on what do we need to change and why do we need to change it. So on the other end, we have folks who are saying, well, let's look at tertiary enrollment. I mean, I'm not seeing that decline in enrollment. If anything, there is just an astonishing increase, especially in Asian countries, Africa and the developing parts of the world. There's an enormous increase in tertiary enrollments. Really, if anything, it's starting to grow exponentially. So that kind of goes against this, well, the university is dying model, because there's an awful lot happening. We've had a 53% increase since 2000 in terms of higher education enrollment. We now have this is a couple years dated. The report was from 2009, so now you've got about 150 million people. Recently heard projections that state we're going to have about 250 million people by 2020 in the higher education sector, so we're going to continue to see substantial growth in the higher education space. And then you have, and these, this is speculative in a lot of ways, but the Times Higher Education had an article out in 2011 where they said India is going to need 800 new university within the next 9 to 10 years. And then yesterday I was hearing this astonishing number of you need to reskill 500 million people in a period of 9 years. Now that number is, I can't fathom that, so I'll just say that it's your number, so I'll agree with you. but it's huge. So there's a lot of things that you can say the existing system likely won't be able to make sense or to be able to deliver that level of education. And then globally, though, for a system that's dying, there's an awful lot of financial investment. So the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology just opened a few years ago. It was initially supposed to be a few billion-dollar initiative, but ended up being a $20 billion system by the time it opened. So around the world, there is a rush to build what's called world-class university. And that's because the universities are being linked to economic growth and economic prosperity of a country. So the quality of your research, the quality of your graduates, the development of your IP is very directly linked to the university structure. And this is a Rockefeller report that emphasizes this as well, which is that universities themselves are an economic growth engine. Now, obviously, they're a lot more. I mean, they're a social rebalancing engine. I would say in a lot of cases, the inequalities that the other systems of society throw up, namely the capitalist model, the business model, government corruption, the inequalities of those systems are supposed to be corrected by the education system. So the education system exists to inject equality into systems that throw up inequality. So whether it's just economic or whether it's social or otherwise, the issue is that universities play an incredibly important role in society, as does higher education. So with this conflicting landscape of it's all bad, it all needs to change, to wow, it's growing extremely rapidly and it's really helping to define the knowledge economy, the question sort of starts to be, what does that mean to us? So I hate to say it, Drucker's wrong. He's only got 15 years left on his predictions, so I'm going to go out and say in 15 years' time, universities will be more, not less important to the societal structure. But they certainly won't be like we know them today, right? They're going to be a very different type of a model. And online learning is certainly going to be one dimension or one aspect of it. I would probably say online/blended, because we're getting more nuanced in our understanding. And the reason is we've tried blended learning and we've tried fully online learning, or fully campus learning, fully online learning, and we're realizing that each of those mediums has a unique benefit that it affords the learner that needs to be integrated meaningfully if we're trying to create smarter students and more educated populace. Distance learning landscape, this is one that's enormously tied obviously to ICT development, and so really around the world, different regions, different systems, that's where attention is being paid. This is where the growth number is, and as I was informed in our session yesterday, this is where entrepreneurial activity is being geared. And on that, just a quick side note, if you consider the economic structure of education, when you have fine folks like Rupert Murdoch, upstanding citizens that realize or that advocate that education is the last sector to globalize, you know there is an awful lot of people with a lot of money, may or may not have a lot of money, and they're turning their attention to the education system. And you're seeing this right now coming out of Silicon Valley. The hardest, or the startups that are now gaining the greatest attention, gaining the most recognition, are educationally oriented. There's startups that 3-4 years ago, like Edmodo, were more social network startups. Well, guess what? Now they're an education startup. So it's going to be one of these things where everyone is starting to pay attention and say, you know, there's something unique in education. We know there's an economic need there. There are inefficiencies within the system. So we're going to take our innovation from any space, content creation, information, communication, and we're going to restructure it or pivot, in the buzzword language, to the education sector. So educational startups, that's probably one of the biggest areas for people if you want to see where are we going to go long term, see some of the ideas that are coming out of this space, and not just out of Silicon Valley. As we heard yesterday, a lot of innovation going on with Indian startups, a lot of innovation also going on in other parts of the world, from trips I've had recently within China, within Africa, and Latin American countries. The EdTech startup space is an extremely rapidly developing field. Doesn't mean it's going to retain the values and ideals of the traditional university model. That's, I think, a responsibility for educators to ensure is preserved. But right now, it's the market forces that are winning the day. Now, another thing that's unique in this regard is obviously the growth of mobile devices, and that has a dramatic impact on what education will look like down the road as well. So we have increased integration where initially you look at the development of mainframes to the mobile internet, projected to be in mid-2000, about around 2015 to be around 10 billion devices around the world that'll be mobile-based. it's a really rapid transition. And the way we interact with mobiles now versus even 4 years ago is quite significantly different. So the mobile space is taking some of the networked experiences of being connected with one another and giving it a online versus physical world connection. So in my eyes, the biggest impact of mobiles long term isn't just that we have the internet wherever we go. For me, the biggest impact I think is going to be that mobiles really do bridge the physical and the virtual worlds, where you start to get data overlays through augmented reality on physical settings, and where you start to have your social networks being activated physically based on where you are geographically as tied to your digital identity. So I think that's the biggest impact we'll see out of mobiles, is how it bridges those two spaces and starts to generate a fairly seamless transition between the two. Databases are now obsolete. Update now. Very good. Now, you've seen a variety of these companies that have come up over time. You've likely heard this. This is Token. You have to put up a slide with different examples and icons when you do a presentation on educational change. So I've done my duty. But everything from Western Governors to Khan to Open Yale to Creative Commons, there is a fairly dramatic change in terms of what are the companies that are, or the organizations that are starting to impact dialogue around openness. And even traditional universities who realize there is something going on in that space are saying, wait a second, we have to get into this area, whether it's utilizing open education resources or whether it's taking a new and alternative approach to teaching and learning. One of the more fascinating ones here was actually U of California. They went to the private equity markets, which is unheard of in the higher education space, to borrow $7 million to help fund this particular project. So they were saying existing state funds, which I just read the other week, that actually it costs more to go to the University of California public education system now than it does to go to Harvard. So there's a terrific example of moving the cost of tuition onto the end users and how well that works. But anyway, so the university sector here decided we know online education is critical. We have to get into this space. We don't have the funds to do it. We have one option, which is go to the private equity markets to raise funds. So you're starting to see where even traditional universities are now towing the economic reality line of this kind of educational climate. All right, so having looked at a variety of things that are not transformative but are disruptive, namely the Khan Academy and a few of those other illustrations, I want to turn now and talk about what are some of the drivers that are transformative, that go beyond just simply tweaking the existing systems, leveraging scale, and making it a little bit more effective. So a few things that are transformative. One I have to say is robots. I'm totally amused by robots, but right now, a recent New York Times article stated that there's more jobs predicted for machines than people in the future. That's a very dramatic impact. And when you have companies that, let's say that are working or partnering with IBM or Apple as part of their supply chain, and they're starting to think, you know what, we're going to maybe build a plant in Brazil that's going to employ basically nothing but robots rather than people. So I think that's very much a disruptive technology. And when you start to read robots and teaching and learning, and robots that actually can directly recognize and interact with students, and it's surprising. And if you wonder, do robots, is that an option? People can acclimate to anything that interacts with them. Whether you have pets at home or whether it's a goldfish or whatever you have around, it's surprising what people can acclimate to and build as part of their interaction system. And that's not new. Folks like Vygotsky emphasize this, the social cultural element to learning, where when we interact with an artifact that was created a generation ago, it's essentially the ideals of that generation touching our reality today. Classrooms are a great example. It's the concepts that existed 100 years ago that still touch our reality today because the ideals were embedded in a physical system. So anyway, robots I think are interesting, and that's one area. Long term, it's not going to happen next year, but if I was going to say what will disrupt education, that will disrupt education. New school, transform, I should say. Robots will transform. New school models, similarly. Here's the telephone plan schools, which are out of Sweden. They've sort of completely done away with classrooms, and they've really taken more of how do we just open up the school system. So you don't have rows, you don't have classrooms, you have flexible spaces of learning. Now, I looked at Vitra, which is the company, and I'm assuming it's a company. They own about 40-some schools. So as far as I understand, it's owned by an equity firm. So that's one group that's driving it, but at least this is an illustration of a very different model of interaction that does away with the classroom approach. Now, cloud computing, I mean, you kind of have to reference that, and it's a buzzword-driven term. And I just want to emphasize there's a difference between software, platform, and infrastructure as a service. So when I'm talking about cloud computing, I'm essentially looking at that entire space. So everything from the technology infrastructure to the software platforms that we use to build new products to the actual software infrastructure, such as Google Docs and otherwise. By the way, if anybody wants the slides, they can be downloaded at slideshare.net/gsiemens if you want any of them. Working differently, certainly the mechanical Turk model, which is available to US customers only, I might add. It's an interesting approach to being able to solve your problems in a distributed or a crowdsourced format. So you rely on the micro expertise of hundreds of thousands of people to help you solve some type of an integrated problem that you face. New assessment models, I don't like badges. I think they're a stupid idea, but they're going to be potentially transformative because they're changing how people are thinking about assessment and evaluation. And so it'll be interesting to see what that goes. So looking at Mozilla Badges Initiative, I think it will have a fairly dramatic influence to education long term. But essentially all we're doing with badges is we're transferring the metrics of a master's or a PhD onto an additional micro-level structure of accreditation. Now, big data and analytics, which have been my area of interest for about the last year and a half or so, I think that is quite transformative or will dramatically alter how we think about education and the process of teaching and learning. Rio Salato, for example, a college out of Arizona, by day 8 can tell within about 80% accuracy whether a student will pass or fail in that course. Now, there's an ethical obligation, right? If you're one of the students that's going to fail, does the university notify you and say, here's your tuition back? I suspect they don't, but nonetheless, their predictive model is accurate to determine who will pass and fail by that timeline. Now, other illustrations of just large-scale data mining. An article for Culturenomics 2.0, they looked at, and this was happening in 2010, this was before you saw a lot of what's now been termed Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Street stuff. They were able to predict the intentions of individuals, the likelihood of global unrest, through an analysis of the tone of media in those particular eras. So when the media tone was of a certain way over a period of time, those patterns began to indicate broad social unrest. So all that big data and analytics really is an emphasis that more is different. David Galenter has just one of my favorite quotes. He says, if you have 3 dogs, give them a name. If you have 10,000 head of cattle, don't bother. So the argument is, if you have a small number of things that you're interacting with, you can interact with it personally or in a certain way. If you have 3 ideas that you're facing on a daily basis, you can interact with each one in a certain approach. If you have 10,000 ideas or 10,000 data points, humanly, you can't interact with that meaningfully. So you begin to rely on algorithmic approaches to generate patterns that you can then use for decision making. So we can't interact with the global information flow because there's millions and hundreds of millions of data points generated each day, but we can, through artificial intelligence or machine learning models, be able to extract certain patterns that may have some kind of an impact. New pedagogical models. Viplav, as I mentioned, he posted up the image of CCK08, which is one of the first open courses that Stephen Downs and Dave Cormier and I did. I do think they have the prospect for dramatic change in education. Because part of what these systems do is it's an online self-organizing social system. It's rather than, and remember earlier I talked about complexity. So what we're emphasizing here is that we don't architect the experience of the learner. Instead, we form a sort of a platform for interaction, and learners, through their social interactions, will self-organize and architect and create their experience. And so we have several courses going on right now. There's the Change MOOC, there's Learning Analytics, and there's a Connectivism and Connective Knowledge. And our emphasis basically is that this is going to be a different experience. If you're looking at someone to tell you what you need to know, then you're going to find this fairly irritating. And I'm not saying that people don't need to be told sometimes. Like yesterday was a perfect day for me to detail the value of a lecture. We had a group of about 7 or 8 different folks that talked about the Indian educational context. I learned a lot more sitting and listening. So I like a good lecture. So I'm not trying to say that's all nonsense. But there are times where you don't just want lectures. You have to interact and create and make as a result of that interaction experience. So what essentially happens with these MOOCs, these open online courses, is it's a relationship change between the educator and the student. So the way, if you're not familiar with these, the way these courses work, they're open, they're online. Sometimes you'll have a few hundred participants, sometimes you'll have a few thousand. So basically, it's taking what might be done in a classroom and then availing it to a network effect and allowing it to morph based on these multiple agents interacting in a sea of feedback. And that's what generates this distributed, chaotic learning experience. And even though the content might be similar from a MOOC to another MOOC, the experience is very different for learners because the high level of generation of content that the learners are engaged in. Now, another point that I think is transformative educationally, and we're at the very early stages of this, is distributed research and discovery networks. There's a great text that was out, I guess it was a few months now. It's called Reinventing Discovery, which looks at how the science process is being changed through the development of global connectivity and what that means. So essentially, from my view at least, when we're looking at open research networks, we're talking cloud-based, crowd-based, network-connected discovery systems. And this is the emphasis on micro-expertise again, which is all of us know something. The challenge is to configure those pieces that all of us know in a meaningful way, that we have an amplification. We can do more together than we can do individually. There's a lot of illustrations of this. If you recall the SARS virus from 2003, that was an example of a networked problem-solving approach in identifying the virus. It was global, involved hundreds, thousands of researchers, each one with a different area of expertise, but it was networked and shared. Another illustration of this, obviously, is the building of anything complex, right? A 747 or putting a skyscraper together. No one person can do that anymore. I mean, there was a time, even 100 years ago, where one person could essentially know a discipline. But we've really moved to this notion or this era of connected expertise, where if we want to do anything meaningful, we have to integrate these micro expertise levels. And there's a research project, an open research project that hopefully I'll announce within the next couple of weeks or so, which is targeted, and if any of you are interested, just let me know later, but it's targeted at bringing together researchers, doctoral students, and initiating some of the key areas of knowledge exploration around technology and higher education. And the reason being, because for a lot of educators, the challenge is finding research dollars, right? So you're always, and yet we have a fairly good rejection rate. So if you're lucky if, let's say you get 15-20% acceptance rate for grant applications. So I was thinking, who does research without getting paid, or who does research without dollars? And the first thing that came to mind, well, those poor grad students and those doctorate students, they're always doing research. And they have to, they don't get paid for it. So how about if we find a way to bring together those students with a global network of educators and other researchers to really create an infrastructure where you can ramp forward the activity around particularly three areas: social media and learning networks, as well as analytics, and then finally on the structure of the university system as a whole. Now, this is where problem arises. I'm going to come at this from a couple of different angles. I should quickly check to see how close I am to being out of time. Okay, still about 15 minutes. So there's a report done by Stasser and Titus in 1985, where they looked at how do people make decisions in groups. And it's really an outstanding paper to this day, to follow up on this concept. So what they did was they took a group of folks and they would create 3 candidates in a particular, for students to vote in a university. And they intentionally structured the candidates so that you would have someone that was obviously the favorite, that they should win because they would have views on things such as campus bars or views on activities that students should be involved in. So they structured them in such a way that one candidate was a very obvious favorite about all the others. The other 2 candidates were weakened intentionally. So what they did then is they asked students, vote for your favorite candidate. Well, not surprisingly, almost 70% of the students voted for the person that the researchers had structured as being, this is the person you should vote for. So then they decided to do something different, because that's this notion of a coherent narrative. And society doesn't bring us coherent narratives. Learning doesn't bring us coherent narratives. Everything's highly fragmented these days and getting more so. So they've created really what I think is a traditional or really a very relevant educational problem. They took a group of students and they gave each of these different students a part of the problem, a part of the profile of the person that they should vote in. And they gave them a very complete profile. So if these students then would have gotten together and shared the information each of them had, they would have overwhelmingly selected a candidate that the researchers had decided would be the ideal candidate. What happened was actually just the opposite, is that the preferred candidate suddenly dropped from a high percentage of being selected down from the 70% initially down to 17, 20, 25% success as selection. So the issue was something was going wrong with the integration of information. All the information was in this network, but students weren't connecting in a meaningful way. And the reason I bring this up is twofold. One, it emphasizes that simply connecting people isn't sufficient. There has to be an adoption of new mindsets. And what they found, the researchers found, was what people did when they got into these network systems, they emphasized on telling others what they knew. They didn't emphasize on listening. And that was the key thing. In order to integrate different ideas, you have to listen. But each person who had a unique piece of information was busy sharing it with others, but wasn't focused on developing a better understanding of what others knew. So I think that's one of the key aspects of this approach. The second key aspect, I think, emphasizes that social systems are error-prone. And ideally, you want a system of a social or a technological system that comes together. So you want to emphasize what, as I mentioned with big data, but what does a technological system do better than social systems? And quite often, especially with large-scale data, it can integrate or at least present possible patterns for individuals to consider. And in this regard, when you have a complex setting, when you have distributed networks, the real value is in the integration. So the integrator rules. I think we're really getting to that point where people who integrate best are the ones who rule the system. And you see this with a lot of examples now. Companies like Pearson and Blackboard, they're moving from one product to an integrated ecosystem. And the reason is that universities are prepared to buy integrated systems. They're not as inclined to buy a one or a single functionality system because the integration is a pain, much like we talked about with this particular, the Stasser and Titus illustration. The integration is a huge problem. So when you get companies now that, and Pearson is on a major buying rampage in the educational technology space, but also, SunGard, DataTel acquisition, or the combination, the Blackboard initiatives, McGraw-Hill, there's a lot of these where people are going out and saying, you know what? If you want to generate economic value in society, in higher education today, you're not going to, one, generate from content. There's no economic value in content, at least no significant value. Software, well, then you come across another problem, right? If you're doing a lot of stuff with software, you can pretty much move open source in a lot of ways. And the reason is what you can duplicate easily can't be an economic value point, right? So if you can duplicate a learning object, a digital learning content, you can't make money off of it because it's low cost to duplicate. Building a server, on the other hand, there is economic value point because your input costs are static with each new iteration. With content, it isn't. So what happens then is companies like Pearson are saying, okay, we are a content company, but that's no longer sufficient. So they're starting to integrate and create this ecosystem where people will pay economically for integration, but whereas they might not pay for content specifically. So, and this is something I was just this morning actually, we had Tim Owens was online and he mentioned this one point with Apple. So his tweet was, wow, after playing with Apple TV for 30 minutes, I understand how big of a draw the whole iTunes ecosystem is. Right? So it's because it's integrated and you really don't have to do much to move from one system to the next. Or as he said in his follow-up tweet, was tempted no less than 5 times to drop money on different sections. Convenience is king of this thing. One-click access to content, and I would say education, that's exactly the same issue. If you're a university administrator, and I probably spend more time talking to them than I should or would like to, if you're a university administrator, you're thinking very different than a classroom level prof or a teacher. You're thinking about scale and economics, and when somebody comes in and says, I'm from Pearson, here's an integrated system, end-to-end content, your marking and grading, and we're going to partner with Newton and we'll personalize the whole process, that's very appealing. Pedagogically, it should cause you a rash, but from an administrator's end, there's a lot of draw. Now, as I get to the final slide, we'll spend a few minutes on questions. So one model of university integration that I've been thinking on lately, maybe it's because I spend probably a good portion of the people who are here at this event today from the external group anyway, I spend a lot of time in an airplane and in an airport. And the Star Alliance or the One World model, I'm almost starting to think that maybe that's a model going forward that we need to start thinking about, which is or multi-system university connectivity and exchange. Part of what the Bologna Accord tried to do in Europe, it's difficult when you have systems of broad economic variance to do this kind of a transition, ask Greece, and then you create a structure where you have a global integrated system of interaction. Because again, my argument here is that integration is economic value. So in this instance, whether it's something like a Star Alliance international, an airport system, or airline system, or whether it's something that happens on a much smaller scale, the issue is right now, almost all thinking around educational technology is surprisingly minimalistic. So we are, even our courses that are going online, we're still preserving the mindset or the structure of a physical classroom. I mean, why are we doing that? Why don't we have huge global open online courses? Or why don't we have courses where we have faculty members from different parts of the world teaching together? I mean, why do we have some of these mindsets that we've just brought in from legacy systems? And like I mentioned, those legacy systems really are the past context touching on our experience today. It's not really necessary anymore. So when we start thinking about openness of content, openness of interaction, openness of teaching, we have a lot of progress in this area. Where we have a lot less progress is on starting to think broad-scale systemic integration and transformation through universities being thought of or conceived as a completely different model that once again is aligned on principles of networks and principles of complexity. So I will leave it there, and I think we have probably about 5 minutes for questions if my internal clock is right. Ooh, 7 minutes. So questions or reactions? I think there's ladies with mics, so I think somebody's trying to find their way to the gentleman straight ahead here. Emphasizing emergence, distributed processes of interaction. Like if we could return to, as we heard yesterday, this Gurukul, did I pronounce that right? That system of education, which emphasizes who you study with and who you interact with, not, can we reduce you to a metric? So the issue I have with badges is it's a preservation of the grade-based, mark-based model of the university. And when I think of complex economies and markets, it just doesn't work that way. When people are hired to work at Google, yes, your initial doorway in might be, did you get a degree from Yale? But subsequently, all of your competence is determined by a completely different set of metrics. But keep in mind, the badge discussion is very controversial. There's some people who absolutely love it. MacArthur is funding it heavily. Hewlett's involved as well. Mozilla is involved. So, just if you don't like the fact that I don't like it, there's 100 different ways to look at it. You'll find conversations online that are very supportive of badges.
What I'm trying to understand, though, is in your mind, how does one prove competency in a given area? Because I agree with you about the university model, but how does one prove competency in a given area? What other alternative is there?
Well, let's look at a few examples of what we do on a daily basis, because we don't always need to prove competency sort of in the traditional way. So, if somebody was to come to me and say, George, I have 3 kids, so if they said, prove your competency as a parent, if I hauled out a certificate and said, I took a babysitting course, you would look at that and you'd say, that's nonsense. Parenting is complex. You can't just say, I took a course, or I took psychology in university, so I learned about human behavior. Most people would look at that and say, that's useless. How I'm going to determine if you're a competent parent is I might talk to your kids, and if they're surprisingly well structured around their views of the world, they're critical thinkers, they're creative thinkers, you would say, well, maybe you contributed to that. So what is the byproduct of what you've done determines competence. So if you write, let's say Moodle, you write software like Moodle, and that gets shared and gets adopted around the world. I don't know how many people have sat down, Martin Dugiamas, and said, I'd like to determine your competence as a programmer, or I'd like to determine your competence as a leader of an international open source software movement. You would probably say, I don't really care about all that stuff. My competence is right here. This determines it for me. So sustained participation is an indication of competence.
Hi, George. I just wanted to touch upon your point of integration being the way forward. If you see the investment that's happening now with Imagine K-12 and all, they're going after really small problems, those companies, typically the startups that are coming from the Silicon Valley. How does this happen in the future? So you say, will all these be rolled up into one integrated solution by someone like a Pearson? Or will there be space for smaller companies to do their thing still?
Well, probably the best thing to do is, in a lot of cases with education, because education is trailing in other sectors of society in various areas. Technology adoption, it's trailing in terms of the use of data and analytics, it's also trailing in terms of globalization. And I say trailing not in a bad way, right? I'm not saying, ooh, that's bad, we should speed up and globalize faster. I'm saying there are other businesses that have already made that transition. And so when we think of what does the pharmaceutical world look like when it's been globalized? Well, you don't have a healthy ecosystem of an awful lot of individual niche players. You have a series of global conglomerates. What does the software world look like once it's globalized and internationalized? So I think, like it or not, there's a real prospect that education will transition in that direction. And to a degree, I mean, you have Laureate and even Apollo and some of these systems, they get a lot of flack for their online offerings. But what a lot of people don't recognize is these are multi-billion-dollar companies that have an awful lot of physical schools. The online education is just where they're getting a bad rap for it right now. But they're a very economically healthy model, and they are definitely moving towards more of a global or integrated system. So these startups right now in Silicon Valley, all you need, and Pearson is Google in educational technology startup right now, right? So they buy up what they don't innovate themselves. They actually fund ed startup weekends just so they can extract good ideas. So short answer is, if education tracks the trajectory of globalization in other sectors, yes, we will end up with global education conglomerates that we will love to hate but have to deal with. There's a question over here. I think we're almost out. Actually, I think we are out of time.
Yeah. George, my question is related to crowdsourcing education knowledge and disseminating that to the learner. And you talked about the challenges in that. So my question is what those challenges are and how to make that feasible. You said different individuals in different parts of the world are so specialist. Until we create networks among themselves, crowdsource and create feasible learning content and knowledge and disseminate to the learner, it is very difficult actually.
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to social and technical systems, right? Where there's certain things that a social system will do well. A social system will personalize, it will adapt, it will change, it will evolve based on the people that are involved. A technical system typically scales. So likely if you're looking at broadening up this model of crowdsourcing, chances are you're going to have a combination of what parts of the system do we want to scale and what parts do we want to have social attributes, because those two can work reasonably well together. The big thing around crowdsourcing, and I can't overemphasize this enough, people don't do a good job thinking together. That's a very important point to emphasize. We like to think that they do, but they really don't. People are brilliant solo thinkers, and when they share their insight with others, then it can be ramped up and scaled or interacted with meaningfully. But if you get 100 people in the room and say, hey, all of you get together and talk for the next hour and create a global education system, it'll be crap. If you get a group of people together and you say, do your best thinking and share it with each other, and this is the value of that micro expertise, this gap filling that comes. All of us are smart in different ways and in different subject areas. We don't all want to be smart the same way. Group thinking makes everyone smart in a similar way because we have the same information. So it's very critical when we start crowdsourcing innovation that we emphasize that people individually need to bring something to the table. That's why with the MOOCs that Stephen, Dave, and I have done, we've emphasized creation. Create an artifact, share an artifact, make it available to others so someone else can interact with your innovation. And on that note, we're out of time.